All right, let's get started. Welcome back, everybody. As you know, we're discussing foreign aid and development. And so far, we've been talking about what foreign aid is and who the key actors are. We know that states primarily distribute foreign aid and they can give it to other states or they can give it to international organizations or non governmental organizations, which then distribute the aid on their behalf. And we've talked about how foreign aid can be looked at cynically or optimistically based upon your point of view and what you believe might motivate the sending country. And these views are complicated and complex, and the debate is unresolved. And there is a question about whether foreign aid can buy growth and promote development, or if it's a dead end, a false alley, so to speak. So, where we are now is we are addressing the question of where foreign aid came from as a concept and as a practice. And more importantly, what about the political economy of aid? Who benefits from aid? Who gives aid and why? And we'll deal with those motivations in more detail. And as you know, the most interesting part about political economy is the interests, the motivations of the actors, their benefits, their vested interests, the way that they interpret their income or their position in relation to the status quo, and what motivates them to make the choices that they make. And so we're going to pick up where we left off in the discussion about the historical origins of foreign aid. And as you know, the Marshall Plan was the starting point, and this was the post World War II period. And remember that politicians like Alfred Marshall in the United Kingdom and President Truman in the United States were deeply concerned about the condition of Western Europe after the war. Remember that Western Europe was devastated. They faced shortages of food and goods. Their industry had been destroyed and decimated for the most part, and they really had to build back up. The condition on the ground was quite concerning, especially because the USSR was recovering so rapidly. And the fear of the growth and the influence of communism really became quite profound. The concern was that Western Europe was too weak vis-a-vis communism, and that a new depression and political and economic instability would result and generate a circumstance where communism would gain further influence and make inroads into Europe, which would be very, very bad for the United States and the United Kingdom and those traditional Western powers that at this point were increasingly defining themselves in opposition to the Soviet Union as the Cold War is beginning to build up steam. And so this concern about the growing influence of communism, the weakness of Western Europe, it led politicians like Marshall and Truman to conclude that there was a need to channel food and goods and capital and money and resources to Western Europe, and to do so in a way that was systematic and institutionalized and that would help Western Europe to rebuild in the face of communism and in this aftermath of World War II. And this is where we got foreign aid. This was the Marshall Plan. And let's watch a video that puts this in context and talks about, in particular, the economic and the political conditions, and focus on the motivations and the interests and the various players involved at this point in time.
It was 1947, 2 years after the guns fell silent. Europe's great cities were in ruins. There was hunger. The worst winter in memory brought the worst harvest of the century. Liberated from the Nazis, Western Europe was in danger of sliding into chaos. Dr. Larry Bland is a historian at the George C. Marshall Foundation.
Prime motivation for launching the Marshall Plan was fear of chaos in Western Europe. You could see this if you went to the movies every weekend on the beginning of the feature where they'd show problems in Europe on the newsreels. Starving women and children affect Americans' hearts. So that there's that aspect, women and children in Germany and West Europe, but also the strength of the Communist Party in countries like France and Italy was very worrisome.
Eastern Europe was occupied by the Soviet army. There was massive unemployment. Europe's industry was at a standstill. Immediately after providing emergency supplies of food and clothing, the US Marshall Plan focused on economic choke points. Without coal to fuel factories and mills, Europe's economy would never recover.
The problem is that much of the coal in Europe comes from German mines, which are flooded and the surface effectively bombed. The Germans have no means of opening these mines, and the United States is going to provide certain key equipment. Now, the Germans are going to mine all the coal, but we're going to pump out the mines and rebuild workers' housing and vaccinate them against tuberculosis and other things that will allow them to work very hard.
And the US insisted the Europeans cooperate to move that German coal to other nations on the continent to heat homes and get factories moving again. The United States authorized $13 billion over 4 years, the equivalent of $100 billion today, spread over 16 countries. But perhaps the most important part of the Marshall Plan was its effect on the morale of Western Europeans. Even former enemies, Italians and Germans, were included. German diplomat Karsten Vogt was a boy during the late 1940s. He says the American generosity provided a huge psychological boost.
Together with the Berlin airlift, it was a changing attitude. Quite of a sudden, the Americans, who were anyhow perceived in a better way than the Russians from the very outset, even during the end of the war, now were seen no longer as primarily as occupiers, but as friends.
Winston Churchill called the Marshall Plan the most unsorted act in history. The recovery from the most destructive war in history was dramatic. Western Europe's gross national product went up 32% in the 4 years of the Marshall Plan's existence. It sparked a generation-long economic boom. It provided a framework for what eventually became the European Union. In Washington for VOA News, I'm George Lewinsky.
So the Marshall Plan was vitally important because it provided the capital inputs, the various goods and products that Western Europe needed to rebuild after World War II. And it was so essential and so effective that in the first 4 years after the beginning of the Marshall Plan, Western European economies grew 32% on average. This was a seismic increase in economic activity, and it meant that Western Europe could escape the chaos and the poverty that befell them after the war. And remember that this is taking place in the context of the conflict between the East and the West and the growing influence and strength of the Communist Party. And so this is political economy. Foreign aid emerged in the Marshall Plan, and it began as a component of a strategy to shore up these Western economies and provide a bulwark against communism. And so as we continue to discuss this, let's not make any mistakes. There are important interests and considerations in play, even as foreign aid functions to improve morale and potentially promote development in those situations where it's so desperately needed. But we will address the question of whether foreign aid is effective. Subsequently, we'll deal with that a little bit later on. But the Marshall Plan certainly seems to suggest that it was. And before we continue, let's just discuss the Marshall Plan in a little bit more detail and in the context of a concept we already understand, conditionality. Now, this is something that we know relates to the terms and rules associated with loans obtained by poor countries or countries who are getting credit from a sending country. They have to follow certain rules or make certain changes or obey certain conditions in order to get the full allotment or the full loan or to get continued support. And the Marshall Plan was actually no different. Between 1948 and 1951, the United States and the UK did send about 13.3 billion to Western European countries, about 146 billion in today's dollars. And the three conditions tied to this money were as follows. First, they had to create mixed economies, and this meant that there needed to be an important role for private enterprise, even as the state owned and controlled certain industries or sectors, often strategic sectors, or those sectors most important to rebuilding after the war. Second, remove government controls with regard to prices, um, various rules about tariffs, and thirdly, cut spending. And that meant reduce those fiscal deficits and rationalize the budget and reallocate those monies and spend them more carefully or in different areas. And all told, these conditions amounted to uh, relative conditionality. The money did not come without strings attached. The Western European countries did have to take certain steps to ensure that they would either receive continued money or that they would remain in the good graces of the sending countries. And what's interesting is that, as you'll see later, this conditionality is not always tied to foreign aid. And in particular, the Chinese government, the foreign aid they give is usually no strings attached. Now, you'll see that that often is tied up with politics because oftentimes Chinese foreign aid flows to the birthplaces of leaders and is most intensely given during the tenures of certain leaders. But the Chinese foreign aid doesn't often have strings attached, whereas the Marshall Plan did. And more recently, money in foreign aid distributed as part of the Washington Consensus has also had strings attached in conditionality, and specifically as it relates to cutting spending and removing government controls and making other changes that would be consistent with the neoliberal approach. This is the essence of the origin of of foreign aid. And what we want to focus on is how essential foreign aid became to rebuilding vital infrastructure. We've talked about how humanitarian aid, military aid, social funding, these are various forms of foreign aid, and foreign aid can come in a variety of different packages. And the Marshall Plan focused most importantly and above all on food and fuel and capital inputs that would be necessary to rebuild industry and rebuild basic productive capacity in places in Western Europe. And this is evident in the huge increase in economic growth in the first 4 years after the beginning of the Marshall Plan. When you invest in infrastructure and in capital inputs, you create the capacity to produce more and to become self-sustaining domestically. And so the Marshall Plan had a rhyme and a reason. And as we saw in the video, 10 years on, Europe's economy was booming, and by all measures, it was in recovery. But there's a really important debate about the Marshall Plan and about the effectiveness of the Marshall Plan. And in a lot of ways, this debate is really kind of a microcosm of the debate about foreign aid in general. And that debate is, does it work? What is the role of conditionality? What is the role of the aid itself? What is the role of the process of recovery that begins naturally in the aftermath of a depression? And generally speaking, the jury is still out. It's actually not really settled. It's not clear, and it's difficult to know what exactly did the work. Was it the aid? Was it the conditionality? Was it natural recovery that might have taken place anyway? To what degree did these various elements work together to produce the recovery? But one thing is clear, the legacy of the Marshall Plan is foreign aid and is the USAID organization institution, which remains the single biggest distributor of foreign aid the world over. And we saw that the United States actually, as a net dollar amount, gives more foreign aid than the next few countries combined, even though as a proportion of its total income, it gives far less than most other or many other comparable advanced countries. So The Marshall Plan is an interesting example of the potential for foreign aid to promote growth, but it's also difficult for us to draw any hard and fast conclusions because of the nature of the devastation, because of the existence of a variety of factors that might have been in play, and because of the sheer devastation in Europe. And it's hard for us to know for sure what really did the work, but foreign aid and USAID in general remain important legacies of the post-war period in the Marshall Plan. And it's useful for us to use the Marshall Plan as a way to begin thinking about, the political economy of foreign aid and who gets aid, who does not get aid, and why. So I actually want to begin to incorporate you, and I want to start with, pretty straightforward question, but one that might be a good way for us to start thinking about where most of this foreign aid goes. If we can see from the start that the U.S. is the biggest distributor. So the question is, what region of the world gets the most foreign aid from the United States?
I think right now that would be the Middle East.
So what would be the rationale? Why would the Middle East get the most, do you think, Max?
In terms of recent history, the Middle East has received a lot of conflict, especially like with Afghanistan and Iraq, with the Gulf War in the 1990s, and they're still recovering from that right now. And I think a lot of the reason that we're sending aid is to prevent communism from embedding itself into their governments, same as we kind of did before with the Marshall.
Yeah, so, do you think that communism is viewed as the biggest threat, or are there new and maybe different threats that are also considerable? I don't disagree. I mean, I think that that might be one consideration. I just don't know if um, the situation is the same as it was in the 1950s and 60s, right? The Cold War is sort of over, and Russia itself is actually sort of more of a mixed economy now. Is there something else in the Middle East that would potentially lead the United States to send a lot of foreign aid over there? Is there some interest or some motivation that might be in play?
I think a lot of it roots back to like 9/11, for instance, where we kind of want to prevent more terrorism incidents supposedly, especially with ISIS and Al Qaeda. I mean, they're not necessarily defeated groups either, and I think we're still trying to prevent uh, the insurgent groups from gaining more power like they had before in the Islamic Spring.
Yeah, so terrorism is probably an important factor, right? And the weakness of many of these Middle Eastern states where terrorism has metastasized and where these terrorist cells have grown, and where the weakness of the state represents a real opportunity for many of these groups like ISIL, at least in the past, more so to potentially gain influence. And Afghanistan is a place that has intermittently fell to the Taliban, and it's a place that remains very weak despite enormous investments of foreign aid by the United States government. But much of the conflict in the Middle East around terrorism is kind of partly linked to destabilizing conflicts that were connected to the Cold War and Soviet invasion and the tensions in the various hotspots that emerged in the 80s and the 90s in the Middle East, around a lot of the sectarian conflict that became especially pronounced with the end of the Cold War and some of the big changes in global politics in those regions. These are factors that certainly help us to understand why the Middle East might get a lot of foreign aid. Uh, it's really interesting to consider that, you know, much like Western Europe was kind of viewed as like a pawn in a sense, right? Like the United States had to invest in Western Europe to prevent that pawn from being taken off the board or from sort of being taken over, so to speak. The Middle Eastern countries like Afghanistan, to some degree are also viewed that way, and foreign aid becomes an important, component or part of the recipe in trying to ensure stability in a place that could potentially, go the wrong way, right, and tilt the balance of power in the region, or give strength or influence to terrorist groups or hostile forces that might represent a threat to the United States. These are all interesting and important points to make. And Victor says, I would think that they get the most aid because they show the most potential in their growth. Victor, are you talking about the Middle Eastern countries? I'm anticipating that you are. Um, but is that true though? And I'm only asking because I don't know. Is it true that the Middle Eastern countries have the largest domestic markets and the fastest growing markets? Um, I think that African countries might have larger markets or at least more potential. I just wonder though if that's really the whole story. Rady says oil. I don't know about that though either, Rady, because the United States is actually a net exporter of oil. We don't really rely on either Venezuela or Middle Eastern countries that much for oil anymore. That was more so the case, a couple decades ago. But I don't know if that geopolitical or geoeconomic consideration is as important as it once was. But that's certainly something to keep in mind, right? The possibility that oil is a factor. Matt, do you have a comment?
Yeah, something I wanted to add on why the United States, like the Middle East, has been the focus of its, foreign aid slash foreign policy for quite a long time now is that just historically speaking, like the Middle East is the cradle of civilization. For most of humanity, it has been a wealthy, prosperous, uh, more cohesive unit. And of course, that was destroyed by the Sykes-Picot Agreement between France and Great Britain. So the Middle East has always been an area of political interest and power throughout all of history. And it was weakened because of colonization. But when it became the center of attention again, because this time it had plentiful oil that a lot of places other needed, it kind of reemerged itself into being the center of attention in the political world. And on top of all the sectarian issues it has from groups and civil war and civil conflict and power struggles.
Yeah. So, the thing is, oil is a factor, and not directly, not in terms of, the US has identified an interest in obtaining control. I really don't think that's it. The United States is a net exporter of oil now. But here's the thing, oil does remain very important, and here's why. Because the sectarian and the group conflict in these weak states often is conflict that is partly waged over control of natural resources, right? So terrorist groups, splinter groups, they identify an interest in obtaining control for themselves, and the conflicts that sometimes result partly from that uh, destabilize these states further. And so even though the United States doesn't, in my view at least, identify a direct economic interest in the oil in the Middle East, they certainly still have an interest in preventing state collapse and in total total collapse of political order in a place that seems to be home disproportionately to terrorist groups that threaten the United States directly. So oil does remain a factor, but I think more in terms of how it can ignite sectarian conflict, or how it can become something that contributes to a threat to the US interest. And certainly there is that historical component too, right? The continued conflict in Afghanistan has to be partly understood in the context of conflict that began decades and decades ago. And Matt is right. The Middle East, this is the cradle of civilization, and it's the place where some of the most sophisticated ancient civilizations existed. And we sometimes forget that. There's an interesting, I think, point about how time and change can change the positions and the fates and the outcomes and the experiences of different places. And obviously, places like Central America and Peru are also similar in that they are also ancient civilizations that were very, very sophisticated, but that have since, as a result of colonialism and power struggles and becoming a contested space, have since sort of gotten the brunt of all this. But very interesting discussions, everyone. Rady says, I'm thinking oil or resources not because we depend on them, but in order to keep the US as a world power. The government may send aid and also policies to keep the things the way they are in terms of countries performing at a lower rate than the US economy. So, market share maybe is a question, just like the US tariffs on China's products. Okay, certainly. So you're all basically getting the gist of this. The Middle East is the place that gets the most foreign aid. And when you look at the 2017 figures, which are the most recent numbers that I could find, you notice that you really in the top 10, with only a few exceptions, most countries are in the Middle East or North Africa. Obviously Afghanistan, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Ethiopia is in Africa, Kenya, South Sudan, Syria, Nigeria. And you can see also that there's considerable variation in the proportion that is either economic or military assistance. And so some places receive, much more military assistance than economic assistance. So Iraq, for example, receives more military assistance than economic assistance. But some places like Jordan receive more economic assistance than military assistance. And what I can tell you, for instance, is that Jordan in recent years has begun to develop a domestic defense industry. And countries develop domestic defense industries for a lot of reasons. They want to become less dependent on other powers, but they also want to arm themselves and become more capable in conflict. And Jordan is a country that is in a strategically important neighborhood and in a place where it's important for the United States to have allies. And, Jordan, Egypt, Israel, those are countries that are more or less stable. And the United States has decided that those are countries who can be invested in as potential partners in stability in the Middle East, and that foreign aid is one way to purchase that stability. But this is only the beginning of our discussion about who gets foreign aid and why. There's a lot to this, and I want to talk to you about the ways and the whys of foreign aid. And again, we'll be dealing with the cynical and optimistic views. Remember that there are these different viewpoints about aid distribution and whether it's fundamentally motivated by self-interest or it's fundamentally motivated by benevolence and a desire to do good. And the cynical view begins often by pointing out that the UN Security Council's rotating members, there are 10 temporary rotating members in the UN Security Council. They receive 60% or more of their aid from the United States during their membership on the Security Council. So in other words, they get most of their aid from the US when they are on the Security Council. Now, why was that important and why would that be significant? Because a lot of people suggest that this is evidence of vote buying, that the United States is giving most of their foreign aid at this moment precisely because they're purchasing the vote of these temporary members of the Security Council who will vote on matters that affect the United States and they will vote for or against the US. The cynical view is that the United States is effectively purchasing their vote by giving them foreign aid, primarily when they are a member of that Security Council temporarily. Now, that's a cynical view, and that's only one potential interpretation. In fact, there are two possible interpretations. But before I give you those interpretations, you should know that the United States, France, Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom all give more aid to states that are their voting friends at the UN General Assembly. That is, states who tend to vote with them and tend to align with them in UN Security Council votes. So obviously, the cynical interpretation of these patterns is that the rich states are using aid to buy the UN votes. That's the cynical view. Um, a less cynical view, but a still pretty cynical view, is that rich states look at UN votes, they see who their friends are, and then they give aid accordingly. But even if we take that interpretation, aren't aren't the friends of the rich states friends in the first place, presumably because of aid that they received? So really, no matter how you look at it, the cynical view basically reduces motivations to self-interest, and it views aid as primarily about vote buying and obtaining and maintaining the support of allies in critical international arenas. And the UN Security Council is certainly a very, very important one. And you may or may not endorse these views. You may be inclined to look at human behavior and see self-interest and see the benefit that individuals might gain from taking certain actions. Or you may not. You may have a more optimistic view. But the truth is that even if we take an optimistic view, there are some pretty obvious geopolitical and strategic motivations. There are some real clear reasons why powerful, rich states like the United States, France, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom would primarily give to those states who vote with them, or to states whose vote they can buy in exchange. And the economic motivations are pretty clear. First of all, developing countries, poor countries, those are markets that can be opened up and liberalized, right? And that can become places where US companies can sell products. And in particular, in places like, you know, Latin America or Africa, where these markets are gigantic, these are rapidly growing countries where there's the potential for massive gain if you can break in and open up those markets by getting them to break down tariffs. It's also the case that if you've begun to break down those tariffs and establish those trade relationships by opening up markets, you can give more aid to trading partners and you can help to constitute and reinforce those trade relations and deepen them and really remove even more tariffs and open up more markets. And you can increase exports to these developing countries ultimately. And the goal is pretty straightforward. These are massive markets where we have the potential to grow and buy and find new customers for our products and for our services. And in this regard, foreign aid can become a useful tool in kind of buying the support of potential new markets, or at least reinforcing their support if it might already exist. This is the cynical view. Now, on this topic, there's a lot of interesting research, and some of the most interesting and notable research comes from Alicina and Dollar in 2000, and they found that being relatively open has a relatively small effect on getting aid. Being an open economy, certainly that might be important, but it's less important than, say, being relatively democratic, having more colonial past, voting more with Japan, being Egypt, or being Israel. In some ways, this is sort of a joke, but this is actual uh, data, and this is a result from a study. It says that if you're Israel, you get 450 times more foreign aid for just being Israel. If you're Egypt, you get about 500 times or about 400 times more more aid. If you vote more with Japan, you get about 200% more aid. If you have a more colonial past, that seems to just sort of be a proxy for allies of advanced countries. You have 100% more aid. Being relatively democratic, also sort of a proxy for just like a sort of partner in the UN Security Council. And then ultimately, being relatively open doesn't matter that much at all. What ultimately matters, it looks like, is you know, these relationships, these personal sorts of relationships that exist between countries, and that are ultimately um, at their very bottom political, and above all political. And so my point in showing you this is that, look, foreign aid, the motivations are obviously complex, right? We can identify a number of reasons theoretically why foreign aid might work to the economic advantage or the military advantage of a country, but in practice, those motivations will often, you know, be very particular and very peculiar to that relationship, right? So the United States and Israel, well, Israel gets money from the U.S. because Israel is an ally of the United States and a stable partner in the Middle East that can help to represent a bulwark against uh, crisis or collapse or the rise of governments hostile to U.S. interests. And on this issue, you know, there is research about why foreign aid is given and what rationales officially have been advanced for official development assistance since 1950. And the three rationales that US government researchers have cited are as follows. First, there's the national security interest. And you know, this relates fundamentally to propping up and supporting countries and states that promote the US's national security interests. And especially in the context of the Cold War, in the conflict, the struggle between communism and the United States, communism, capitalism, the Soviet Union and the United States, and then in the post 9/11 context around terrorism and the sort of sectarian and other conflicts that have begun to represent a threat to stability in the Middle East and U.S. interests in a region that traditionally has has been important to U.S. interests. The second rationale is those commercial interests, and those commercial interests relate fundamentally to creating new buyers and creating and opening up new markets for US goods, US services. These commercial interests relate often to, well, as I'm sure you can imagine, the comparative advantages of the United States. And so that is in particular in things like weapons or financial services, technology, you know, those areas that the US is capable of producing goods more efficiently and at a lower opportunity cost, and where they have the most to gain by opening up new markets. And so the United States, for instance, works tirelessly to give foreign aid to countries that might open up their defense markets and make it possible to import US weapons more cheaply and more easily. And one way the US does this is by giving foreign aid to countries that set up policies of using natural resource export revenues to purchase weapons imports with foreign exchange. And so foreign aid is often used to promote these commercial interests around these comparative advantages. And then finally, at the very end of the list is humanitarian concerns. You know, if you thought that foreign aid was primarily given in the name of disaster relief or eradicating poverty, I'm sorry to inform you that humanitarian concerns actually occupy the smallest proportion of the giving, and it's less often the case that disaster relief or pro poverty mindsets motivate giving. It's more often the case that national security concerns and commercial interests motivate giving. And when you really think about it, national security concerns and commercial interests are often very much intertwined, and so they can almost be thought of as one in some sense. Before we move on, does this surprise you? Does this come as a surprise, or does this shock the conscience, or does this seem about right to you?
I get a little surprised when people think that foreign aid is anything else than like just a political tool.
Yeah, I mean, look, countries have interests, right? States have interests. And I don't even know if it's fair to say that they have friends, right? These are political relationships that are created and constituted with, pork, the stuff that makes the gears go round, and that makes these coalitions and these alliances form and hold together. And you wouldn't be surprised then maybe to learn that the United States doesn't just give foreign aid to developing countries. It gives them to advanced countries too, because they use foreign aid to constitute and reinforce alliances. And so these national security interests are fundamental and critical to the choice to give foreign aid. Now look, with that being said, it doesn't mean that foreign aid doesn't do any good, right? I think it's possible for foreign aid that's 75% national security and military aid to still be 25% pro poverty or pro poor in orientation. It could be that that's just the price of doing business, right? And that if we can determine that it does do some benefit, but then you might argue, well, in the name of peace, we should stop giving money in the name of propping up militaries and strengthening alliances that exist to use coercion and force and ultimately end lives. But these are some of the big questions that we encounter in a debate like this, right? Is foreign aid a force for good or not, if we acknowledge that it's fundamentally about national security and commercial interests? Rady says, I personally thought foreign aid was more humanitarian aid targeted. Oops, I guess not. Hey, Rady, I think it depends, right? I showed you on Wednesday that there are non-governmental organizations and IGOs that do give foreign aid in the name of reducing poverty and promoting development. It's just that, that might be a sliver of the overall giving. And the overall picture might be more complex, especially if we acknowledge that the US gives more foreign aid than anyone else by a long shot, although it's still a small proportion of its total income. So, we keep it real in here, and keeping it real is also concerned with, letting actors speak for themselves. And so what does the US government say are the official reasons for ODA, or official development assistance? And so if you go to the USAID website, or if you read their materials, this is what they say. It says that the aid is for promoting economic growth and reducing poverty, improving governance, addressing population growth, expanding access to basic education and healthcare, protecting the environment, promoting stability in conflicted regions, protecting human rights, curbing weapons proliferation, strengthening allies, and addressing drug production and trafficking. Now, some of those relate to U.S. national security interests. I wouldn't dispute that, strengthening allies, promoting stability. I wouldn't dispute that those are consistent with U.S. national security interests, while simultaneously being upstanding reasons for giving foreign aid. It's just that, the fine print, if you can even read the fine print, really might give you more information about where that foreign aid is going and what kinds of motivations and interests might be at stake. So, for instance, is promoting economic growth and reducing poverty, does that really mean promoting economic growth, or does that mean shoring up vulnerable populations that might otherwise throw their allegiance or their support behind the Taliban, right? So it's kind of like, yeah, sure, you're promoting economic growth, but you're mainly concerned with ensuring stability and strengthening the state in a place that could fall to a hostile force or a hostile power or an antagonistic actor. And so, look, we should just acknowledge that these interests are complicated and complex, and that states give foreign aid for many reasons, and that when we consider the political economy of aid, um, it becomes a complicated picture and nuanced, and that there might be a variety of different motivations. Now, look, there is also the optimistic view, and I don't want to make you think that the only view in the discussion is the dystopian, cynical view. There are those who view foreign aid and donors as fundamentally good and as optimistic and hopeful and something that we can lean our hats on and anticipate contributing to development and promoting development and all those good things that we like. But the truth is that the groups and the actors that are better at focusing on poverty and promoting development tend to be NGOs and non-governmental organizations, with some exceptions. So the UK is one country that tends to be relatively good at giving most of its foreign aid to low income and poor countries. 81% of its foreign aid goes to low income countries, whereas the United States only comes in at 41%. But for the most part, it's non governmental organizations and entities that don't have a reliance on states mainly, or that are primarily controlled by states that give to poor countries. So the World Food Program, the UNDP, these sorts of groups, UNICEF, the Asian Development Bank, they're all better at giving to poor countries in the name of promoting poverty reduction than countries like the United States or Japan or even the Netherlands. And so there's variation. And when you look at the picture, there are many different kinds of actors, and the different views that we might take hold up less well or better, depending upon which actor we're talking about and who's giving the foreign aid in question. The optimistic view also emphasizes the benefits of foreign aid for democracy. And so OECD countries, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, those advanced economic um, countries give more foreign aid to democracies. And so that's important because it increases the chance of democratic transitions, and it reduces the chances of democratic backsliding or reversions to authoritarianism. It's been shown pretty persuasively, statistically, that foreign aid to democracies can improve the chances of sustaining democracy. And so the optimistic view is often focused on the benefits of foreign aid for for reducing poverty when it's given in the name of reducing poverty, and then also the benefits in promoting democracy when it's given to democracies or countries that are on the precipice of transitioning to democracy. Listen, everybody, we're not quite done with our foreign aid lecture, but we'll finish it next week, and we'll talk about China And we'll wrap up the lecture by finally discussing the effectiveness of foreign aid. Thanks so much for being here and for being a part of it as always. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you on Monday.